Welcome to the presentation on Good Clinical Practice, Part 5, Sponsor's Responsibilities. Access to records. The sponsor should ensure that it is specified in the protocol or other written agreement that the investigators or institutions will provide direct access to source data or documents for trial-related monitoring, audits, IRB or IEC review and regulatory inspection. The sponsor should verify that each subject has consented in writing to direct access to his or her original medical records for trial-related monitoring, audit, IRB or IEC review and regulatory inspection. Safety information. The sponsor is responsible for the ongoing safety evaluation of the investigational products. The sponsor should promptly notify all concerned investigators or institutions and the regulatory authorities of findings that could affect adversely the safety of subjects, impact the conduct of the trial, or alter the IRB or IEC's approval or favorable opinion to continue the trial. Adverse drug reaction reporting. The sponsor should expedite the reporting to all concerned investigators or institutions and to the IRBs or IECs where required and to the regulatory authorities of all adverse drug reactions ADRs that are both serious and unexpected. Such expedited reports should comply with the applicable regulatory requirements and with the ICH guidelines for clinical safety data management, definitions and standards for expedited reporting. The sponsor should submit to the regulatory authorities all safety updates and periodic reports as required by applicable regulatory requirements. Clinical trial monitoring. The purposes of trial monitoring are to verify that the rights and well-being of human subjects are protected. The reported trial data are accurate, complete and verifiable from source documents. The conduct of the trial is in compliance with the currently approved protocol or amendments and with GCP and with the applicable regulatory requirements. Selection and qualification of monitors. Monitors should be appointed by the sponsor. Monitors should be appropriately trained and should have the scientific and or clinical knowledge needed to monitor the trial adequately. A monitor's qualifications should be documented. Monitors should be thoroughly familiar with the investigational products, the protocol, written informed consent form and other written information to be provided to subjects, the sponsor's SOPs, GCP and the applicable regulatory requirements. Extent and nature of monitoring. The sponsor should ensure that the trials are adequately monitored. The sponsor should determine the appropriate extent and nature of monitoring. The determination of the extent and nature of monitoring should be based on considerations such as the objectives, purpose, design, complexity, blinding, size and endpoints of the trial. In general, there is a need for on-site monitoring before, during and after the trial. However, in exceptional circumstances, the sponsor may determine that central monitoring in conjunction with procedures such as investigators' training and meetings and extensive written guidance can assure appropriate conduct of the trial in accordance with GCP. Statistically controlled sampling may be an acceptable method for selecting the data to be verified. Monitor's responsibilities. The monitor, in accordance with the sponsor's requirements, should ensure that the trial is conducted and documented properly by carrying out the following activities when relevant and necessary to the trial and the trial site. Acting as the main line of communication between the sponsor and the investigator, verifying that the investigator has adequate qualifications and resources and remain adequate throughout the trial period, that facilities including laboratories, equipment and staff are adequate to safely and properly conduct the trial and remain adequate throughout the trial period. Monitor's responsibilities. Verifying for the investigational products that storage times and conditions are acceptable and that supplies are sufficient throughout the trial, that the investigational products are supplied only to subjects who are eligible to receive it and that the protocol specified doses, that the subjects are provided with necessary instruction on properly using, handling, storing and returning the investigational products, that the receipt, use and return of the investigational products at the trial sites are controlled and documented adequately, that the disposition of unused investigational products at the trial sites complies with applicable regulatory requirements and is in accordance with the sponsor. Monitors has responsibility to verify that the investigator follows the approved protocol and all approved amendments, if any. Verify that written informed consent was obtained before each subject's participation in the trial. Ensure that the investigator receives the current investigator's brochure, all documents and all trial supplies needed to conduct the trial properly and to comply with the applicable regulatory requirements. Ensure that the investigator and investigator's trial staff are adequately informed about the trial. Verify that the investigator and the investigator's trial staff are performing the specified trial functions in accordance with the protocol and any other written agreement between the sponsor and the investigator or institution and have not delegated these functions to unauthorized individuals. Monitors has responsibility to check the accuracy and completeness of the CRF entries, source documents and other trial related records against each other. The monitor specifically should verify that the data required by the protocol are reported accurately on the CRFs and are consistent with the source documents. Any dose and or therapy modifications are well documented for each of the trial subjects. Adverse events, concomitant medications and intercurrent illnesses are reported in accordance with the protocol on the CRFs. Visits that the subjects fail to make, tests that are not conducted and examinations that are not performed are clearly reported as such on the CRFs. All withdrawals and dropouts of enrolled subjects from the trial are reported and explained on the CRFs. Monitors has responsibility to inform the investigator of any CRF entry error, omission or illegibility. The monitor should ensure that appropriate corrections, additions or deletions are made, dated, explained, if necessary and initialed by the investigator or by a member of the investigator's trial staff who is authorized to initial CRF changes for the investigator. This authorization should be documented. Determine whether all adverse events are appropriately reported within the time periods required by GCP, the protocol, the IEC or IRB, the sponsor, and the applicable regulatory requirements. Determine whether the investigator is maintaining the essential documents. Communicate deviations from the protocol, SOPs, GCP, and the applicable regulatory requirements to the investigator and taking appropriate action designed to prevent recurrence of the detected deviations. Monitoring procedures. The monitor should follow the sponsor's established written SOPs as well as those procedures that are specified by the sponsor for monitoring a specific trial. Monitoring report. The monitor should submit a written report to the sponsor after each trial site visit or trial-related communication. Reports should include the date, site, name of the monitor, and name of the investigator or other individuals contacted. Reports should include a summary of what the monitor reviewed and the monitor's statement concerning the significant findings or facts, deviations and deficiencies, conclusions, actions taken or to be taken and or actions recommended to secure compliance. The review and follow-up of the monitoring report with the sponsor should be documented by the sponsor's designated representative. Sponsor's audit. If or when sponsors perform audits as parts of implementing quality assurance, they should consider purpose. The purpose of the sponsor's audit, which is independent of and separate from routine monitoring or quality control functions. It should be to evaluate trial conduct and compliance with the protocol, SOPs, GCP, and the applicable regulatory requirements. Selection and qualification of auditors. The sponsor should appoint individuals who are independent of the clinical trials or clinical trials systems to conduct audits. The sponsor should ensure that the auditors are qualified by training and experience to conduct audits properly. An auditor's qualifications should be documented. Auditing procedures. The sponsor should ensure that the auditing of clinical trials or systems is conducted in accordance with the sponsor's written procedures on what to audit, how to audit, the frequency of audits, and the form and content of audit reports. The sponsor's audit plan and procedures for a trial audit should be guided by the importance of the trial to submissions to regulatory authorities, the number of subjects in the trial, the type of and complexity of the trial, the level of risks to the trial subjects, and any identified problems. The observations and findings of the auditor should be documented. To preserve the independence and value of the audit function, the regulatory authorities should not routinely request the audit reports. Regulatory authorities may seek access to an audit report on a case-by-case basis when evidence of serious GCP non-compliance exists or in the course of legal proceedings. When required by applicable law or regulation, the sponsor should provide an audit certificate. Non-compliance management. Non-compliance with the protocol, SOPs, GCP and or applicable regulatory requirements by an investigator or institution or by members of the sponsor's staff should lead to prompt action by the sponsor to secure compliance. If the monitoring and or auditing identifies serious and or persistent non-compliance on the part of an investigator or institution, the sponsor should terminate the investigator's or institution's participation in the trial. When an investigator's or institution's participation is terminated because of non-compliance, the sponsor should notify promptly the regulatory authorities. Premature termination or suspension of a trial. If a trial is prematurely terminated or suspended, the sponsor should promptly inform the investigators or institutions and the regulatory authorities of the termination or suspension and the reasons for the termination or suspension. The IRB or IEC should also be informed promptly and provided the reasons for the termination or suspension by the sponsor or by the investigator or institution as specified by the applicable regulatory requirements. Clinical trial or study reports. Whether the trial is completed or prematurely terminated, the sponsor should ensure that the clinical trial reports are prepared and provided to the regulatory agencies as required by the applicable regulatory requirements. The sponsor should also ensure that the clinical trial reports in marketing applications meet the standards of the ICH guideline for structure and content of clinical study reports. Note, the ICH guideline for structure and content of clinical study reports specifies that abbreviated study reports may be acceptable in certain cases. Multi-center trials. For multi-center trials, the sponsor should ensure that all investigators conduct the trial in strict compliance with the protocol agreed to by the sponsor and, if required, by the regulatory authorities and given approval or favorable opinion by the IRB or IEC. The CRFs are designed to capture the required data at all multi-center trial sites. For those investigators who are collecting additional data, supplemental CRFs should also be provided that are designed to capture the additional data. The responsibilities of coordinating investigators and the other participating investigators are documented prior to the start of the trial. All investigators are given instructions on following the protocol, on complying with a uniform set of standards for the assessment of clinical and laboratory findings, and on completing the CRFs. Sponsor should ensure that the communication between investigators is facilitated.